Welcome back to Wickerson Studios. Michael Wickerson here. We're into the 002 Params tutorial, following the menu overlooking and generally talking about what we'll be doing in Params first. What we want to take a look at here is right off the bat something that's familiar. And one of the most familiar things in Grasshopper, besides the number slider, which has lots of editing abilities but not as kind of convenient as it was in Grasshopper 1, it seems. The other thing we used a lot was the panel. But first and foremost, you cannot type things into your panel to use it as inputs. And you're going to realize that runs through quite a bit of things when dealing with trees and data sets, and this is for people that really want to go from skilled with Grasshopper 1.0 to Grasshopper 2.0. And your alternative is to use the text panel. And so with the text panel, as I bring it in, that's what I'm going to start with. So saving all of this, the text panel is something I bring in immediately. And what you're going to find is a right click on this white area is strange, will allow you to change the name in the gray area. And a left click on the black area will allow you to change the content text only within the text area. And we'll see that as we distinguish here. But the tool itself has its own documentation. If you right click and hit question mark, the documentation will open. You'll just have to slide it over so you can use it and get convenient with where you want to put it. And that's the way I open documentation. However, as I showed earlier, you can open it within the help menu by clicking here and opening documentation, but then you're not going to be on the node that you've actually opened. If you find something that you kind of want to have interesting, mark it with a interesting node, and important, mark it with the red. So a really nice little interface. Not a ton of text in here on this one, but it's enough to get us started. What I also want to do is talk a little bit about the input value, which is something you bring in. And if we look there, you'd see that you can use values, more values via textual input. But I'm not going to use that too much. That's enough to get you started, and it kind of, there's no scribble tool that I've found so far, and you have to use this as text, and you got to kind of deal with it and interface with it. But whenever you bring something in like that, read the small print, drag it down and read. Click and drag the top or bottom grip, and they'll really tell you an awful lot about it, which is kind of nice. Another thing is when you right click, if these nodes come from any plugins that give credit to those plugins. That's something my assistant Sergi noticed today. But really what we want to cover in this first video is pretty simple. You'll notice that the hexagon containers continue in Grasshopper 2.0, but they've really kind of hierarched them in different ways. And these are, I would think, essential for getting your eyes around and taking a look at, because even though I'll show you a few examples of why that's important. Generic I pulled in here, and generic will handle anything. And once again, you can right click, you can go to the documentation, there's nothing extra. But you're going to want to get in the habit of doing that almost on everything as you acclimate yourself to Grasshopper 2.0. Text, you really don't have to zoom in if you can get enough from what's being said just by hovering. So a sequence of textual characters with no additional formatting or typesetting. Identifiers, kind of interesting if you're thinking about using those and finding the GUIDs. And then language is something as a container that I wasn't even considering Grasshopper 1.0. So until it's necessary, I'm going to go to think about that icon and see if it comes up. I like the little accent on the U. Color is one that you'll see coming up again and again. It kind of reverses positive and negative as you hover over it. And you can see even hovering over that, you can use RGBs, HSLs, XYZ, and LAB. So I might go into that one and see if there's a little more documentation, but there isn't. Gradient is something you'll be play with, and you're going to find those tools, which I assume go with the metas, which is something that's going to be very important for Grasshopper 2.0. And here's the metadata that you might want to start thinking about supplementing your nodes with, and your meta naming as well as containers. One thing to think about is because the path mapper and the relative items and the and all the wonderful nodes that were in sets under tree in Grasshopper 1.0, you've got to wrap your head around the understanding of paths, and then a path with an index is going to be your site. And you're going to see that as we go through. And there's a thing in here that I find very frustrating initially, that I can't type in a text tool or a value tool a path and an index and make it work. I have to pull my sites out of nodes into panels so they work as inputs into sites once we get into more complex data tree manipulation. I'm not doing much with a tuple right now, but it's a wonderful way to have kind of a static thing, so a group of named values acting as a single value. That will get you through the data, step 1, so data A, but let's go into data B, which might start to look a little more familiar. You want to drag these out, and there's something here I want to show just briefly, and it's a small thing I noticed, that if I'm comparing data, and I have an integer, let's say, and even though this may seem simple, and I have a float or a decimal or a number, and I'm comparing these, it is essential if they're going into a node comparatively that this node gets copied and you type any integer. So instead of 7, say the digit was 7, it would say 7.0 coming out of here, but there is no number put in here as a number slider left. Then I can compare those data types. That's a little subtlety, but it does mean a lot, and you're going to find a lot of frustration because it's kind of like moving from Python to C#, in my opinion. You've got to be really sensitive to what's going on. Booleans are hard to come by, but what I would do for a Boolean, if I wanted to input one, not just as a container, is I'd pull a number slider out, I'd immediately right click, I'd change it to the integer, and I would have what's comparable to a Boolean. And even though those are in the pickers, that's a nice way to get a Boolean that goes from true to false. So that's something I'm kind of choosing to do as well. Angles are outstanding. You're going to find you can work in radians, degrees, gradients, turns, everything within that. And complexes are going to build some beautiful geometry as well. And there even are quaternions in this, which I'm trying to wrap my four-dimensional mind around, rotating complex numbers even again. I'm not sure if I got my head into that, but I left math before going that deep. You will see a lot of inputs that count as numeric, and you'll just want to be using that probably away from numbers or from decimals. And function is absolutely the thing that makes Grasshopper 2.0 the most exciting. And even though there's a function here, even up here in inputs we'll get to, this tool is like the graph mapper on steroids. And just to show you it, as we right click on here, you can jump in and start dealing with all the math operations, all the operators, and even take this farther into managing the vectors and the curves of what's going on in here. And you can put functions upon functions, chain rule, inference one function from another function, and you've got this ability to have a grid snap on it and a grid snap with grips. This is absolutely the most amazing node, and it's hard to leave it. And if you look at it as a text output or input and consider what you could do with OpenAI from ChatGPT, you'll see where I've actually really got that zooped up on steroids. Intervals will handle everything that all domains used to handle for you. You'll just have to find a way to construct them, and it gets more and more complicated as we go through here from data into the maths, from params into maths. You're going to find that your distributions really matter if they're continuous distributions or if they're discrete distributions. And just to jump ahead to the maths and show you statistically, you've got an awful lot of C distributions and D distributions that you can play with. And this just gets more and more exciting. To make it through the params and make it through the math tab and data tab, you're going to feel like you're a god compared to where you were. Random itself is going to prepare you for what's over in the maths and the random, and you're going to have such a wonderful way to play all the way down the randoms and getting into sequences, which will deal with ranges, and then you'll deal with number sequences, which are out. I just want to jump ahead a little bit with the series node, and for those not realizing that Grasshopper 2.0 has a documentation that will be as good as far as I'm concerned as Rhino, right click on it and take a look at what happens here. And if it doesn't have an enumerator through here, these points, you actually technically have to type in these things, but you have incredible control to what you'll do computationally. So the series node, once again, is on steroids. Fantastic device. But you're just preparing for it as containers. Haven't done anything with date or time. I'll probably find a use to it. And the last section of this first intro, which I know is pretty basic just looking at containers, wrap your head around it. You are memorizing these icons. And I'm going to just go down here for a second to graph. When you have a map coming out, you're going to recognize that icon is the same, and you can chase it back to a map container from a graph container. But we'll get there. Initially, you know your points. Vectors are incredible because there is no display vector. You will be able to see your vectors in Grasshopper 2.0. You can deal with fields, multiple, and you can deal with planes in a wonderful way. And I think if you're actually modeling your geometry with these 4 containers, you're going to have incredible control. The end point is just amazing to fathom an n-dimensional point, and working a point with a variable number of Cartesian coordinates, just fantastic. And think about the transform node, where you used to pull up transformations as a matrix in Grasshopper 1, but now you have containers for different specific things you'd want. Lines, rectangles, polylines, triangles bring you back to, and I don't want to crash this because having this much on one document does sometimes crash when I move this, but if I took a look at the Rhino document again, you could kind of go up to the curves section and realize that all of this is kind of in there, from circles, curves, arcs. Now this is where, if you think at point at on a curve in t parameter, you might want to start thinking of curve locus as that point, and you might want to think of surface locus as the MD slider. It's a multi-dimensional slider on a surface. And then you can go back to boxes, surfaces, spheres, tubes, and graphs will come into play, and I'm going to leave mesh and mesh facets for a little while. But graph is something that I'm really starting to get my head into, and you'll see that effects later on. So that's it to start. We are going to continue, and we're going to go into the inputs under params, and we're going to break down the use and interaction of how to get things going. And you could really slow down in this section, especially when you start looking into constant pickers and the options of what can be done. But we'll look at that in the next video, and then we'll take a look at utilities as we get going again. Some really nice surprises. Shout and listen, worth looking forward to. So that's it to start. We're just taking a look through the containers. We're trying to memorize visually these icons, because whenever we see a node farther down the line that needs data and you hover over it, you're going to see those icons. So there's the first point, what you'll need, the second point, what you'll need, and this is a metric. And once again, reason to use, we'll get here in a minute, documentation is metrics, and methods are going to show you enumerated or other forms of actually presetting picker to go through. We'll do that in the next one. So try not to complicate too much, but you need to memorize these container icons. Thanks very much for watching.